The frigid Montana wind cut through Eliza Parker's wool coat as she stepped off the train, her entire life packed into 2 weathered suitcases. She'd traveled over 5,000 miles from Boston, leaving behind a life of factory work and loneliness, for the promise of marriage to a man she'd only exchanged letters with. Thomas Blackwell had painted such vivid pictures of his ranch nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, a place where wildflowers carpeted the valleys in spring, and the night sky sparkled with more stars than she'd ever imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as Eliza scanned the nearly empty platform at the Rivercrest station, the knot in her stomach tightened. There was no sign of Thomas, no smiling face emerging from the small crowd to claim her as his bride. Instead, she was greeted by the solemn face of Sheriff Mason Hayes, his badge glinting in the late afternoon sun, his hat clutched respectfully in his weather-worn hands. "Miss Parker?" he asked, though his eyes told her he already knew exactly who she was. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Thomas Blackwell." What follows is a tale of shattered dreams, buried secrets, and unexpected second chances that would forever change the course of Eliza Parker's life and the lives of the Blackwell brothers in ways none of them could have possibly imagined. Montana. Territory 1887. Eliza Parker had spent the last 3 days on a train headed west, each mile taking her further from everything familiar and closer to a future she could only imagine. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels had become a constant companion, almost lulling her into a trance as she watched the American landscape transform from crowded cities to endless plains, and finally to the jagged silhouettes of distant mountains. She smoothed down the wrinkles in her best blue dress, saved specifically for this moment, and checked her reflection in the small hand mirror from her purse. 26 years old and never married was practically a death sentence for a woman in Boston society. The textile factory, where she'd worked for 8 years, had slowly drained the youth from her face, but today her cheeks were flushed with a mixture of anticipation and terror. Thomas's letters, carefully bundled and tucked into her suitcase, had been her lifeline over the past 10 months. What had begun as a practical advertisement in the Boston Herald, established Montana rancher seeks educated, hard-working wife, had blossomed into something that, while not quite love, felt remarkably close to it. "Rivercrest Station, Rivercrest, Montana," the conductor called, startling Eliza from her thoughts. She gathered her belongings with trembling hands and made her way to the exit. The platform was nothing like the grand stations of the East, just a wooden structure with a small waiting area and ticket office. A handful of people milled about, most looking like they were there to collect packages rather than passengers. The biting cold of early March took her breath away as she stepped onto the platform. Thomas had warned her about Montana winters, how they lingered well into what Bostonians would consider spring. She pulled her coat tighter and scanned the faces, looking for the man who matched the description from his letters. Tall, with broad shoulders, sandy brown hair, and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, according to his own modest account. Instead, a man in his 50s approached, badge catching the sunlight. Even before he spoke, something about his solemn expression made her stomach drop. "Miss Parker?" Sheriff Hayes asked, removing his hat. "I'm Sheriff Mason Hayes. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." "Where's Thomas?" The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. The sheriff's eyes filled with a compassion that terrified her. "Perhaps we should sit down, Miss Parker. There's a bench just over here." She followed him mechanically, her luggage suddenly feeling twice as heavy. They sat, and Eliza noticed how the sheriff seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Thomas Blackwell passed away 3 weeks ago, Miss Parker. Pneumonia took him quick. Dr. Simmons did everything he could, but—" He trailed off, watching her face carefully. The world around Eliza seemed to slow and distort. 3 weeks ago, she had received a letter from Thomas, speaking about preparations for her arrival, how he'd added a new room to the house specifically for her to use as a study since she'd mentioned loving books. "That can't be right," she whispered. "I received a letter 3 weeks ago." Sheriff Hayes frowned. "The letter must have been sent before he fell ill. News travels slow out here, especially in winter. I'm truly sorry, Miss Parker. I know this comes as a terrible shock." Eliza felt numb. She had no home to return to in Boston. She'd given up her boarding room, quit her job at the factory. Every cent she'd saved had gone into this journey. Did he have a family? Someone who should have... She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas kept to himself mostly, had a falling out with his brother years back. Jacob left town and hasn't returned since. There's a housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, who's been looking after the ranch, but the sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "The thing is, Miss Parker, without a will or family present, the situation with the ranch is complicated." Eliza barely heard him. Her mind was racing through the impossibility of her situation. 5,000 miles from home, with nowhere to go, and only enough money to last a few weeks, if she was careful. "Is there lodging in town?" she asked finally, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. Sheriff Hayes nodded. "There's a boarding house run by Widow Collins. It's respectable and affordable. I can take you there now if you'd like." What choice did she have? Eliza nodded, rising from the bench on unsteady legs. The sheriff collected her larger suitcase while she clutched the smaller one, and they made their way down the town's main street. Rivercrest was larger than she'd expected from Thomas's descriptions. A proper town with a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and various other establishments lining the wide dirt road. "It's the building just ahead," Sheriff Hayes said, gesturing to a 2-story white house with green shutters. "Widow Collins is a good woman. She'll help you get settled." Before they reached the boarding house, Eliza stopped. "Sheriff, where is he buried? Thomas, I mean." The sheriff's expression softened. "Town cemetery just behind the church. I can show you tomorrow if you'd like." "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like that." The boarding house was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Martha Collins was a plump woman in her 60s with kind eyes and practical hands. When Sheriff Hayes explained the situation, her face filled with sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear. What a terrible journey to make, only to arrive to such news. Of course you'll stay here. I have a room on the 2nd floor that gets lovely morning light." The sheriff tipped his hat and left Eliza in Mrs. Collins' capable hands. The widow showed her to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair near the window. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Collins said, "though I can bring something up if you're not feeling sociable." Eliza shook her head. "Thank you, but I'll come down. I need to think about what comes next." Once alone, Eliza sank onto the bed and finally allowed the tears to come. She wept not just for Thomas, a man she'd never met in person yet had, come to care for deeply through his words, but for herself and the future that had disappeared before it even began. After crying until no more tears would come, she unpacked her few belongings and washed her face in the basin provided. She changed into a simpler dress and made her way downstairs for the evening meal. The dining room held a long oak table where 4 other boarders were already seated. Mrs. Collins made quick introductions. Mr. Peterson, the town's school teacher, the Mercer sisters, 2 elderly women who had lived at the boarding house for over a decade, and Dr. Simmons, the town physician who sometimes stayed at the boarding house when winter weather made the journey to his homestead too treacherous. "Dr. Simmons, you treated Thomas Blackwell, didn't you?" Eliza found herself asking as bowls of stew were passed around. The doctor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up in surprise. "I did, yes. Were you acquainted with Mr. Blackwell?" "I was to marry him," Eliza said simply, causing a hush to fall over the table. "I see," Dr. Simmons said after an uncomfortable pause. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Parker. Mr. Blackwell was a good man. Was his passing? Was it painful?" She needed to know, even if the answer brought her no comfort. The doctor's expression was gentle. The fever took him quickly. He was lucid until near the end, and then he simply slipped away. Eliza nodded, pushing her stew around her bowl without eating. "You should eat, dear," one of the Mercer sisters, Eliza couldn't remember which was which, said kindly. "Keeps your strength up. You'll need it." The conversation shifted to other topics, and Eliza was grateful no one pressed her further. She managed a few bites of the rich stew and a piece of bread before excusing herself and returning to her room. That night, she lay awake, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the wind rattling the window panes. Thomas had described the Montana winds in his letters, how they seemed to carry whispers from the mountains. Now, those whispers felt like ghosts, haunting her with possibilities that would never come to pass. In the morning, Sheriff Hayes arrived, as promised, to escort her to the cemetery. March in Montana was bitter, with patches of snow still clinging to the shadowy places. The town cemetery was small but well-maintained, with neat rows of headstones and iron fencing surrounding the perimeter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas's grave was marked by a simple stone. Thomas James Blackwell, 1852-1887, May. He vined peace among the stars. The freshly turned earth was the only indication of how recent his passing had been. Eliza stood before it, clutching the bundle of letters she'd brought with her. She'd thought about leaving them at his grave, but found she couldn't part with them. They were all she had left of the man who had promised her a new beginning. "Would you like a moment alone?" Sheriff Hayes asked. "Please." She nodded, and he retreated to a respectful distance. Eliza knelt beside the grave, not caring about the mud staining her skirts. "I don't know what to do now, Thomas," she whispered. "I came all this way for you, for us. Where do I go from here?" Only the wind answered, rustling through the bare branches of a nearby oak tree. When she rejoined the sheriff, he seemed hesitant. "Miss Parker, there's something you should know. Thomas's ranch, it's a valuable property. Without a will and with no family present to claim it, there will be legal proceedings. It might take months to sort out." "I have no claim to it," Eliza said flatly. "We weren't married." "No, but there's the matter of the letters, the agreement between you. It's not unheard of for courts to consider such arrangements, especially out here where formal documentation isn't always possible." Eliza blinked in surprise. "Are you suggesting I could have a claim to Thomas's property?" "I'm suggesting you speak with Judge Henderson. He handles legal matters for the county." The sheriff hesitated. "The thing is, Miss Parker, Thomas was well-liked but private. Few people knew much about his personal affairs. If there's a brother out there somewhere, he'd have the strongest claim, but no one's heard from Jacob Blackwell in years." The revelation that she might have some legal standing was unexpected. Eliza had been mentally calculating how long her remaining money would last and what kind of work she might find in Rivercrest. "I never came here for Thomas's property," she said firmly. "Of course not," the sheriff agreed. "But you came for a future, and now that future's been taken from you. Seems to me you deserve something for that." They walked back to town in thoughtful silence. At the boarding house, Sheriff Hayes tipped his hat in farewell, but turned back before leaving. "Miss Parker, there's a gathering at the saloon tonight." "Not the rough kind," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Once a month, folks gather. For music and conversation. Might do you good to meet some of the townspeople, especially if you're considering staying on." Eliza nodded non-committally. The thought of socializing seemed exhausting, but isolating herself would do no good either. That afternoon, she ventured out to explore the town properly. Rivercrest was laid out in a simple grid, with the main street running east to west and smaller streets branching off it. She found the general store and went inside, partly out of curiosity and partly to escape the cold. The store was a treasure trove of necessities and luxuries, shelves stocked with canned goods and dry staples, bolts of fabric, tools, and even a small selection of books. The proprietor, a balding man with friendly eyes, introduced himself as Henry Mitchell. "You must be Miss Parker," he said, surprising her. "News travels fast in small towns. I'm sorry about Thomas. He was a good customer. And a fair man. Did you know him well?" Eliza asked, hungry for any information about the man she'd come so far to marry. "As well as anyone, I suppose. He came to town once a month for supplies, sometimes more often if he needed something specific. Always paid his bills on time. Never complained about prices." Mr. Mitchell paused, considering. "He changed these past few years, became more social, started attending town functions. Before that, he kept to himself mostly, especially after the trouble with his brother." "What trouble?" Eliza asked, trying to sound casual despite her intense interest. Mr. Mitchell leaned in slightly. "Well, I probably shouldn't gossip, but seeing as you were to be family—" He checked to make sure no other customers were within earshot. Jacob and Thomas had a falling out over the ranch. Their father left it to both of them, but Jacob wanted to sell to some mining company that was buying up land in the area. Thomas refused, said the land had been in the family too long to sell to outsiders. "So Jacob left?" Eliza prompted when Mr. Mitchell paused. "After a fight that nearly tore the saloon apart, yes. That was 6 years ago now. Some say Jacob headed to California. Others heard he went up to the gold fields in Alaska. Thomas never spoke of him again, at least not that I heard." This was all new information to Eliza. Thomas had mentioned having a brother in his letters, but had never gone into detail about their estrangement or the reasons behind it. "Thank you for telling me," she said sincerely. "You planning to stay in Rivercrest, Miss Parker?" Mr. Mitchell asked as she browsed the store's offerings. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "I need to find work, at the very least." "Well, if you've got any experience with figures, I could use help with the books. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and my daughter, who usually helps, is expecting her 3rd child." Eliza brightened at this unexpected opportunity. "I kept accounts at the textile factory in Boston for 3 years before being promoted to floor supervisor. Is that so?" Mr. Mitchell looked genuinely interested. "Stop by tomorrow and we can discuss it further." With a flutter of hope in her chest, for the first time since arriving in Rivercrest, Eliza purchased a few small necessities and headed back to the boarding house. That evening, after some deliberation, she decided to attend the gathering at the saloon. She changed into her second-best dress, a forest green that Mrs. Collins had kindly pressed for her, and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style. The saloon was already lively when she arrived, though not in the raucous way she'd feared. Tables had been pushed aside to create an open space where a trio of musicians played fiddle, guitar, and banjo. People of all ages filled the room, families with children, elderly couples, young men and women laughing together. Sheriff Hayes spotted her near the entrance and came to greet her. "Glad you could make it, Miss Parker. Let me introduce you around." Over the next hour, Eliza met so many people she could scarcely keep their names straight. Everyone expressed condolences. For Thomas, many sharing small anecdotes about him that painted a picture of a respected, if somewhat reserved, member of the community. "He spoke of you, you know," said Mrs. Peterson, the schoolteacher's wife. "Not by name, but he mentioned he was corresponding with a lady from back east. I've never seen him look so hopeful." The comment brought tears to Eliza's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Thank you for telling me that." As the evening progressed, Eliza found herself drawn into conversation with a group of women closer to her own age. They were curious about Boston and life in the East, and Eliza found their questions a welcome distraction from her grief. She was just beginning to relax when the saloon door swung open with enough force to bang against the wall. A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned toward the newcomer. He stood silhouetted in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. A tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly where it met the collar of his travel-worn coat. His face was tanned and weathered, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw, but it was his eyes that captured Eliza's attention, piercing blue and eerily familiar. "Jacob," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd. "Sheriff." Hayes stepped forward. "Jacob Blackwell. Been a long time." The man, Jacob, scanned the room, his gaze briefly meeting Eliza's before moving on. "Sheriff," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I hear my brother's dead." The bluntness of the statement caused another murmur through the crowd. Sheriff Hayes frowned but nodded. "He is. Pneumonia 3 weeks ago." Something flickered across Jacob's face, an emotion Eliza couldn't quite identify. Grief, regret, anger. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Then I need a drink," Jacob said, moving toward the bar. "And then you and I need to talk." The music had stopped, and an uncomfortable tension filled the room. Gradually, conversations resumed, though noticeably quieter than before. Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away from Jacob Blackwell. This was Thomas's estranged brother, the man who had abandoned the ranch and his family years ago. What was he doing back in Rivercrest now? As if sensing her scrutiny, Jacob turned, his blue eyes meeting hers again across the room. This time his gaze lingered, a question forming in his expression. Eliza looked away quickly, her heart racing inexplicably. Sheriff Hayes approached her moments later. "Miss Parker, perhaps it would be best if you returned to the boarding house. It's getting late." She knew he was trying to shield her from whatever confrontation might be brewing, but something made her stand her ground. "I'd like to stay, Sheriff. After all, Jacob Blackwell and I have something in common. We've both lost Thomas." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but stay clear of Jacob for now. He was always volatile, and there's no telling what state of mind he's in after hearing about Thomas," Eliza agreed, though she found her gaze continually drawn back to the dark-haired man at the bar. He had downed one whiskey and was working on a second, his posture rigid with tension. After a hushed conversation with Jacob, Sheriff Hayes approached her again. "Miss Parker, there's been a development. Jacob would like to speak with you, privately. At my office tomorrow morning." "With me? Why?" Eliza asked, genuinely confused. The sheriff's expression was unreadable. "He says he has information about Thomas. Information you need to hear." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana weather. "What kind of information?" He wouldn't say. Just that it changes everything. Sheriff Hayes glanced back at Jacob, who was now watching them intently. "Will you come?" Eliza hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I'll be there." As she left the saloon, she could feel Jacob Blackwell's eyes following her. Whatever news he brought with him from his years away, Eliza sensed it would indeed change everything, not just for the future of the Blackwell Ranch, but for her own fate in this remote Montana town. Eliza barely slept that night. She tossed and turned in the narrow bed at the boarding house, her mind racing with questions about Jacob Blackwell and the mysterious information he claimed to possess. By the time dawn broke over the eastern mountains, she had already dressed and was sitting by the window watching as Rivercrest slowly came to life. "You're up early?" Mrs. Collins remarked when Eliza appeared in the dining room. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." "Thank you," Eliza said, accepting a steaming cup. "I'm meeting with Sheriff Hayes and Thomas's brother this morning." Mrs. Collins's eyebrows shot up. Jacob Blackwell? My, I never thought he'd show his face in Rivercrest again, not after what happened. What exactly happened between the brothers? Eliza asked, seizing the opportunity to learn more. The widow hesitated, then sat down across from Eliza. It wasn't just about selling the ranch, though that was part of it. There was a woman involved, isn't there always? She sighed. Rebecca Carter. Prettiest girl in the county and sweet as summer honey. Both Blackwell boys were smitten with her, and she chose Thomas. That's the thing, she chose Jacob. They were even engaged to be married. But then Jacob started pushing to sell the ranch, talking about taking Rebecca to San Francisco, where they could live like royalty. Mrs. Collins shook her head. Rebecca didn't want that life. She was a country girl at heart. When she told Jacob she wouldn't leave Rivercrest, he accused Thomas of turning her against him. Did Thomas do that? Who knows? Thomas always claimed he didn't, that he respected his brother's engagement. But after the big fight at the saloon, Jacob left town, and Rebecca was heartbroken. She waited almost a year for him to return before eventually marrying the banker's son. They moved to Denver shortly after. This new information cast the brothers' feud in a different light. Eliza wondered if Thomas had ever truly gotten over Rebecca. Had his decision to seek a mail-order bride been driven by lingering loneliness? At precisely 9 o'clock, Eliza made her way to the sheriff's office. The morning was clear but cold, the mud from yesterday frozen into rutted tracks along the street. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, as much for comfort as for warmth. Sheriff Hayes was waiting outside his office, hat in hand. "Miss Parker," he greeted her solemnly, "Jacob's already inside. I should warn you, he's agitated this morning. Whatever he has to tell you seems to be weighing on him heavily." "I'm prepared to hear it," Eliza said, with more confidence than she felt. The sheriff's office was a small building with a front room containing a desk and several chairs, and a back room with 2 cells separated by iron bars. Jacob Blackwell was pacing the front room like a caged animal when they entered. He stopped abruptly, his intense blue eyes fixing on Eliza. In the daylight, the resemblance to Thomas, or at least the description Thomas had given of himself, was apparent. Jacob had the same strong jawline and broad shoulders, though his features were harder, more weathered by sun and experiences. Where Thomas had described himself as sandy-haired, Jacob's hair was darker, nearly black, with threads of silver at the temples. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, "thank you for coming. I'm curious what information you could possibly have that concerns me, Mr. Blackwell," Eliza replied, keeping her tone even. Jacob gestured to a chair. "Please sit down." Eliza sat, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. "Sheriff?" Hayes positioned himself near the door, clearly intending to stay for the conversation. Jacob remained standing, too restless to sit. "I received a telegram in Seattle 3 weeks ago," he began. "From Thomas. He was asking me to come home, said it was urgent. I ignored it at first. We hadn't spoken in 6 years. But then a second telegram came a week later. He said he was dying and needed to see me before the end." Eliza's heart clenched at the image of Thomas, alone and ill, reaching out to the brother who had abandoned him. "I started for Rivercrest immediately, but winter travel is slow. By the time I reached Missoula, I heard the news that he'd passed." Jacob's face hardened. "What the telegram didn't mention was you, Miss Parker, or the fact that my brother was planning to marry." "I don't understand," Eliza said slowly. "What does this have to do with the information you claim to have?" Jacob looked directly at her, his blue eyes intense. "The information is this. Thomas was already married when he began corresponding with you." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I assure you it's not only possible, it's the truth." Thomas married Rebecca Carter 6 months after I left town. They kept it quiet. A judge in Helena performed the ceremony. When I heard about her death last year—" "Death?" Eliza interrupted, struggling to process his words. "Typhoid fever," Jacob said, his expression softening slightly at her obvious distress. "She died last spring. Thomas was devastated. I only found out when I started asking questions on my way here." Sheriff Hayes stepped forward. "Jacob, if what you're saying is true, why would Thomas seek a mail-order bride when he was still in mourning? And why wasn't Rebecca buried here in Rivercrest?" "Because she wasn't in Rivercrest when she died," Jacob replied. "She was visiting her sister in Bozeman. As for why Thomas sought a bride so quickly," he shrugged. "Grief makes people do strange things. Maybe he couldn't bear to be alone. Or maybe he thought a fresh start would help him forget." Eliza's mind was reeling. If Jacob was telling the truth, then Thomas had deliberately deceived her. He'd never mentioned a previous marriage in any of his letters, let alone one that had ended so recently. "Do you have proof of this marriage?" she asked, finding her voice at last. Jacob reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "Marriage certificate. I found it among Thomas's papers at the ranch. Mrs. Wilson let me in yesterday after the gathering." Sheriff Hayes took the document and examined it. "It appears genuine," he said after a moment, passing it to Eliza. The certificate stated clearly that Thomas James Blackwell and Rebecca Ann Carter had been united in marriage on November 18, 1881, in Helena, Montana Territory. The signatures were clear, the seal official. "Why are you telling me this?" Eliza asked quietly, returning the certificate to Jacob. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because it affects the legal situation with the ranch." Jacob ran, a hand through his dark hair. "With no will, Thomas's property goes to his next of kin. If he had no wife, that would be me. But if he had promised the ranch to you in his letters—" "He never explicitly promised me ownership," Eliza said, remembering Thomas's letters. "He wrote about building a life together there, but the ranch was always his in the way he described it." Jacob nodded. "Then legally it falls to me. But that's not why I came back, Miss Parker. I came because my brother was dying and wanted to see me. I was too late for that, but I'm not too late to honor his final wishes." "Which were?" Sheriff Hayes prompted when Jacob fell silent. "To make things right," Jacob said simply. "With the ranch, with Rebecca's memory. And now it seems with you, Miss Parker." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Eliza's thoughts were a tangled mess. She had traveled across the country to marry a man who, it turned out, had been hiding significant parts of his life from her. What else hadn't Thomas told her? "I think I need some time to process this," she finally said, rising from her chair. Jacob stepped forward. "Miss Parker, Eliza, there's more we need to discuss about your situation here in Rivercrest." "My situation is my concern, Mr. Blackwell." She turned to Sheriff Hayes. "Thank you for arranging this meeting, Sheriff, if you'll excuse me." Outside, Eliza gulped the cold air, trying to steady herself. The revelation about Thomas's previous marriage had shaken her foundation. Had anything in his letters been true? Had he ever intended to marry her, or was she simply a distraction from his grief? Without conscious direction, her feet carried her toward the cemetery. She needed to confront Thomas, even if only in spirit, about this deception. The graveyard was deserted this morning. Eliza made her way directly to Thomas's grave, still fresh with turned earth. She stood over it, anger and confusion warring within her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered to the silent stone. "Did you think I wouldn't understand? That I would judge you for having loved before?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the bare branches overhead. "Miss Parker." Eliza whirled around to find Jacob Blackwell standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. She hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said quietly. "I thought you might come here." "Have you come to share more shocking revelations, Mr. Blackwell?" He winced at her tone. No, I've come to apologize. I was abrupt back there. The news about Thomas's death and finding out about you, it's been a lot to take in." Despite her anger, Eliza could see genuine distress in his eyes. "For both of us," she acknowledged. "I also wanted to tell you that I've spoken with Mrs. Wilson about the ranch. She mentioned that Thomas had prepared a room specifically for your arrival. Study, she said. The mention of the study, something Thomas had written about in his final letter, brought fresh pain." "What of it?" "I thought perhaps you might want to see it. To see the ranch. Whatever Thomas's intentions, he clearly cared for you in his way." Eliza hesitated. Part of her wanted nothing more than to flee Rivercrest, to forget this entire misadventure, but another part, the practical, forward-thinking part that had survived 8 years in a Boston factory, recognized that she had nowhere to go. "Why would you offer this?" Jacob's expression was unreadable. "Because Thomas wished for it, and because I owe him that much at least." After a long moment, Eliza nodded. "Very well. I would like to see the ranch. I have a wagon waiting in town. We can go now if you're ready." The Blackwell Ranch lay 5 miles outside of Rivercrest, nestled in a valley with mountains rising on 3 sides. The main house was larger than Eliza had expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy pine logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Mrs. Wilson met them at the door. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes softened when she saw Eliza. "Miss Parker," she said, extending a work-roughened hand, "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Mr. Thomas spoke very highly of you." "Thank you," Eliza murmured, touched by the woman's kindness. "I've shown Mr. Jacob to his old room," Mrs. Wilson continued, "and I've prepared the guest room for you, should you wish to stay overnight. The weather looks to be turning." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising snow or cold rain by evening. Eliza glanced at Jacob, who merely shrugged. "It's your decision. Mrs. Wilson can drive you back to town before the storm hits if you prefer." "I'll stay," Eliza decided. "I'd like to see the study Thomas mentioned in his letters." Mrs. Wilson nodded approvingly. "I'll show you. Mr. Thomas worked on it for weeks, wanting everything to be just right." She led Eliza upstairs to a corner room with windows facing east and south. The space was smaller than Eliza had imagined from Thomas's descriptions, but it had been furnished with obvious care. A solid oak desk sat beneath the east window, a comfortable chair pushed up to it. Bookshelves lined one wall, half filled with volumes ranging from practical guides to poetry and fiction. "He ordered most of these books special from Helena," Mrs. Wilson said, running a finger along the spines. "Said you had mentioned liking Dickens and the Bronte sisters." Eliza's throat tightened. She had indeed mentioned her fondness for those authors in her second letter to Thomas. The fact that he had remembered and gone to such trouble. "I'll leave you to explore," Mrs. Wilson said tactfully, slipping from the room. Alone, Eliza moved around the space, touching the furniture, examining the books. On the desk, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages blank except for an inscription on the first page. "For Eliza. May your thoughts flourish in our new life together. Thomas." Tears pricked at her eyes. Whatever his deception about Rebecca, this room proved that Thomas had genuinely been preparing for Eliza's arrival. He had wanted her to have a space of her own, to pursue her love of reading and writing. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jacob stood in the doorway looking uncertain. "Mrs. Wilson is preparing dinner," he said. "She also mentioned there are some of Thomas's personal effects you might want to see." "What sort of effects?" "Letters, mostly. Documents. Things she thought might help you understand him, understand why he sought you out. Eliza considered this. Did you know her well? Mrs. Wilson, I mean. She was here when we were boys, Jacob confirmed. She helped raise us after our mother died. Thomas trusted her completely. This was more than a housekeeper then. Mrs. Wilson was practically family to the Blackwell brothers. I'd like to see the documents, Eliza decided. Downstairs, Mrs. Wilson had laid out a wooden box on the dining table. These are Mr. Thomas's personal papers, she explained. Letters from Miss Rebecca, mostly, and his journal from after her. Passing? Eliza hesitated. Should I be reading such private thoughts? He kept no secrets from you that death hasn't already revealed, Mrs. Wilson said firmly. And it might bring you some peace to understand his state of mind. Jacob cleared his throat. I'll leave you to it. I should check on the livestock before the storm hits. Once he had gone, Eliza opened the box. Inside were bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbon, a leather journal, similar to the one in the study, and several loose papers. The journal first, I think, Mrs. Wilson suggested, placing it before Eliza. The journal began 3 days after Rebecca's death. Thomas's handwriting, so familiar to Eliza from his letters, was shaky in the earliest entries, filled with grief and despair. He wrote of feeling that half his soul had died with Rebecca, of the emptiness of the ranch without her laughter. As weeks passed, the entries grew more coherent, but no less heartbreaking. Thomas described trying to maintain the ranch, struggling through each day. By autumn, a new theme had emerged in his writings: loneliness. The silence is the worst of it, he had written in September. I find myself talking aloud just to hear. A human voice. Mrs. Wilson worries. I can see it in her eyes. Perhaps she is right to worry. In October, the first mention of seeking a wife appeared. Mrs. Wilson suggested I might consider advertising for a wife, as Anderson did last year. The idea seems cold, mercenary even, but the thought of another long winter alone in this house. November's entries showed his internal struggle. To seek a new wife so soon after Rebecca, would it dishonor her memory? Or would she want me to find companionship, to build a new life? She always said life was for the living. By December, Thomas had resolved to place the advertisement. His entry on the day he sent it was brief but revealing. The deed is done. I have written the advertisement in careful terms, seeking companionship and partnership rather than love. Love, I think, comes only once in a lifetime. Eliza's heart ached at these words. Thomas had never promised love in his letters. It was true. He had spoken of respect, of building a life together, of companionship. She had hoped love might grow with time, but now she understood that Thomas had never expected it to. The entries about their correspondence began in January. Received 3 responses to my advertisement. 2 seem unsuitable. Too young, seeking adventure rather than partnership. The 3rd, from Miss Eliza Parker in Boston, shows promise. Her letter is thoughtful, practical. No romantic notions or unrealistic expectations. I will write to her. As their correspondence continued, Thomas's entries became more positive. He mentioned projects around the ranch, preparations for spring planting, repairs to the house. Eliza featured prominently. Miss Parker mentioned her fondness for reading. The east bedroom would make a fine study for her. Good morning, Light. By February, Thomas was writing about the future with cautious optimism. Miss Parker has agreed to come west. She will arrive in early March. The study is nearly complete. Ordered books from Helena that she mentioned enjoying. For the first time since Rebecca's passing, I feel something like hope. The final entry was dated March 1st, just 3 weeks before Eliza's arrival. Feeling unwell today. A chill I can't seem to shake. Mrs. Wilson insists I stay abed, but there is too much to do before Eliza arrives. Sent a telegram to Jacob today. 6 years of silence is too long. Whatever our differences, he is my brother. I would see him once more before The entry ended abruptly, as if Thomas had been interrupted, or had suddenly lacked the strength to continue. Eliza closed the journal, her emotions too tangled to name. Thomas had been honest in his way, never promising what he couldn't give. He had sought partnership, not love, and in his final days he had reached out to his estranged brother, perhaps seeking reconciliation before it was too late. "He never meant to deceive you," Mrs. Wilson said quietly, observing Eliza's expression. "He just couldn't bear to speak of Rebecca in those early letters. And later I think he feared you might withdraw if you knew he was still grieving." "I wouldn't have," Eliza said softly. "I would have understood." Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "I believe you would have. And in time, I think Thomas might have found more than companionship with you. He was beginning to live again, thanks to your letters." The front door opened, bringing a gust of cold air, and Jacob, his coat dusted with the first flakes of snow. "Storms, and coming in faster than expected," he announced, stamping his boots. "We'll be snowed in by morning." Mrs. Wilson nodded briskly. "I'll prepare extra food, just in case. Miss Parker, you'll find spare nightclothes in the dresser in your room. They belong to Miss Rebecca, but that's all right," Eliza said quickly. "I have my own." Jacob's expression was unreadable as he looked between the journal and Eliza. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I'm not sure what I was looking for," Eliza admitted. "But I understand Thomas better now." Mrs. Wilson excused herself to check on dinner, leaving Eliza and Jacob alone with the box of letters and documents. "There's something else you should see," Jacob said after a moment, reaching for the loose papers in the box. He selected one and handed it to Eliza. "Thomas drafted a will before he became too ill to sign it. Mrs. Wilson found it among his papers." Eliza scanned the document. It was clearly written in Thomas's hand, though the writing was shakier than in his letters. The content was straightforward. Thomas intended to leave the ranch to Eliza upon their marriage, with provisions for Mrs. Wilson's continued employment and residence in the caretaker's cottage. "It's not legal without his signature," Jacob said, "but it shows his intentions clearly enough." "Why are you showing me this?" Jacob's blue eyes met hers directly. "Because I want you to understand that Thomas meant to provide for you, and because I'm prepared to honor his wishes in my own way." Before Eliza could ask what he meant, Mrs. Wilson called them to dinner. The conversation over the meal was stilted at first, but gradually eased as Mrs. Wilson shared stories of the brothers as boys, their adventures and misadventures growing up on the ranch. "You should have seen them with their first horses," she chuckled. "Jacob, fearless from the start, galloping before he could properly sit the saddle, and Thomas, cautious, methodical, studying every movement before attempting it himself." "That sounds like Thomas," Eliza said, smiling faintly. "The cautious one and the reckless one," Jacob mused. "Some things never changed." After dinner, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the house. Snow fell in earnest now, blanketing the valley in white. Eliza stood at the window in the main room, watching the transformation of the landscape. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "And dangerous," Jacob replied, coming to stand beside her. "These spring storms can be the worst. We're lucky to be indoors." Eliza turned to face him. "Mr. Blackwell, Jacob, please." "Jacob," she amended. "What did you mean earlier about honoring Thomas's wishes in your own way?" He was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the swirling snow. "I meant that while I can't legally enforce Thomas's unfinished will, I can still respect his intention. To provide for you, I don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's recognition of what you gave up to come here, of what Thomas wanted for you." The firelight played across his features, softening the hard lines of his face. In that moment, Eliza could see more clearly the resemblance to Thomas, not just in physical features, but in a certain steadfastness, a certain integrity that both brothers seemed to possess despite their differences. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. Jacob turned to face her fully. "I'm proposing that you stay, Miss Parker. Here, at the ranch, as a partner." "A partner?" Eliza echoed, not quite understanding. "In the ranch, a business partner. You would have a share in the operation and its profits, a place to live, purpose." He hesitated. "It's not what Thomas offered you, I know, but it might be a beginning." Eliza stared at him, trying to process this unexpected offer. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You've only just returned to Rivercrest yourself." "Because it's what Thomas would have wanted," Jacob said simply. "And because I owe it to him, to both of you." Before Eliza could respond, a tremendous crack split the night, the sound of a tree branch breaking under the weight of snow, followed by a crash somewhere on the property. "That came from the direction of the barn," Jacob said, already moving toward the door. "The livestock! You can't go out in this," Eliza protested, but Jacob was already pulling on his coat. "I have to. Those animals are our livelihood." Without thinking, Eliza reached for her own coat. "Then I'm coming with you." "Miss Parker, if we're to be partners, Mr. Blackwell, then your concerns are my concerns." She met his surprised look with determination. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not helpless." For the first time since his arrival in Rivercrest, something like a smile touched Jacob's face. "I'm beginning to see why Thomas chose you," he said softly. Together, they stepped out into the storm, the wind and snow swallowing them as they made their way toward the darkened barn and toward whatever future awaited them at the Blackwell Ranch. The storm's fury engulfed Eliza and Jacob as they battled through knee-deep snow toward the barn. Wind whipped ice crystals against their faces, and visibility had diminished to mere feet ahead. Jacob gripped Eliza's arm, keeping her close as they struggled forward. "Stay behind me!" he shouted over the howling gale. "The path dips here!" The branch that had snapped lay across the yard, its massive weight having crushed part of the barn's roof. As they drew closer, they could hear the distressed sounds of horses and cattle inside. Jacob wrenched open the barn door, and they stumbled. Inside, grateful for the sudden absence of wind, lanterns still hung from hooks, and Jacob quickly lit one, illuminating the damage. A section of roof had given way, allowing snow to drift into one corner of the structure. Thankfully, the animals were clustered at the opposite end, agitated, but unharmed. "We need to secure that opening," Jacob said, assessing the situation. "Otherwise, the whole roof might collapse under the weight of the snow." Eliza removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together to restore circulation. "What can I do?" Jacob looked at her with newfound respect. "You can hold the lantern while I climb up to that beam. There's lumber stored along the back wall. We can fashion a temporary brace." For the next hour, they worked together in the frigid barn. Jacob climbed into the rafters, carefully testing each beam for stability. Eliza proved herself useful, not just holding the light, but anticipating his needs, handing up tools and materials before he had to ask for them. "You've done this kind of work before," he observed during a brief pause. "My father was a carpenter. Before the consumption took him," Eliza explained, passing him a hammer. "I was his only child, so I became his apprentice by default." Jacob smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard edges. "Thomas never mentioned that in his letters about you." "There's a great deal Thomas didn't know about me," Eliza replied, "just as there was much about him I didn't know." The shared work created an unexpected camaraderie between them. By the time they had secured the damaged section of roof with a series of braces, Eliza's earlier wariness had eased somewhat. Jacob Blackwell might be rough around the edges, but he was capable and determined, qualities she had always respected. "That should hold until morning," Jacob said finally, climbing down from the rafters. His face was streaked with dirt, his hands raw from the cold. We'll need to make proper repairs once the storm passes. We, Eliza echoed, suddenly remembering his offer of partnership. Jacob met her gaze steadily. I meant what I said back at the house, Miss Parker. The offer stands, if you want it. I need time to consider, she said carefully. It's not a decision to make lightly. Of course. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. There's no rush. The storm will keep us here for at least a day or two anyway. After checking that the animals had feed and water, they prepared to return to the house. The storm had intensified, the wind now a constant, deafening roar. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. We'll need to use a guide rope, Jacob said, securing a length of thick rope to a hook beside the barn door. Hold on to this with one hand and my arm with the other. Don't let go, no matter what. The journey back to the house, though only 100 yards, was treacherous. Twice Eliza stumbled in the deep snow, and once a powerful gust nearly pulled her off her feet. Jacob's strong grip kept her upright and moving forward. By the time they reached the porch steps, both were exhausted and half frozen. Mrs. Wilson was waiting anxiously at the door. "Thank the Lord!" she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "I was about to come looking for you myself." The barn roof partially collapsed, Jacob explained, as they shed their snow-crusted outer garments. "We've secured it for now." "Sit by the fire, both of you," Mrs. Wilson ordered. "I'll fetch blankets and hot coffee." They settled in the main room, where the fire had been built up to a roaring blaze. Eliza held her hands toward the flames, willing feeling back into her numb fingers. Beside her, Jacob did the same, their shoulders nearly touching in the shared pursuit of warmth. Mrs. Wilson returned with blankets, wrapping one around Eliza's shoulders before doing the same for Jacob. "You'll both catch your death," she scolded, though there was affection in her tone. "What were you thinking going out in this weather?" "We were thinking about saving the livestock," Jacob replied mildly. "The ranch can't afford to lose a single animal." The housekeeper sniffed disapprovingly, but didn't argue further. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with steaming mugs of coffee laced with something stronger. "Medicinal," she explained, noting Eliza's questioning look, "to ward off the chill." The coffee, enhanced with whiskey, spread warmth through Eliza's body. Between the fire, the blanket, and the drink, she gradually stopped shivering. Beside her, Jacob seemed to relax as well, his rigid posture softening. "Thank you for your help." "In the barn," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Most women I've known would have stayed by the fire." "I'm not most women," Eliza replied simply. "No," he agreed, studying her face in the firelight. "You're not. I can see why Thomas was drawn to you." An uncomfortable silence fell at the mention of his brother. Eliza sipped her coffee, thinking about the journal she'd read earlier. Thomas had sought companionship, not love. He had been honest in his way, even if he had omitted significant truths. "He wrote to me for nearly a year," she said finally. In all that time, he never once mentioned Rebecca. Jacob's expression darkened. He probably couldn't bring himself to speak of her, even in letters. Their marriage was complicated. Complicated how? He hesitated, swirling the liquid in his mug. Thomas loved Rebecca completely. That was never in question. But Rebecca... He trailed off, seemingly unsure how to continue. "Mrs. Collins told me Rebecca chose you initially," Eliza prompted, "that you were engaged." "We were," Jacob confirmed, "but it wasn't as simple as her choosing between us. Rebecca was conflicted. She cared for both of us in different ways." He paused, searching for words. "With me, she felt passion, adventure. With Thomas, she felt security, steadiness." "And when do you want to leave Rivercrest?" "She chose security," Jacob said, a trace of old bitterness in his voice. "Or perhaps she simply chose Thomas. I never gave her the chance to explain." Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly moving about the room, stoking the fire and tidying, spoke up unexpectedly. That's not entirely fair, Jacob. You presented her with an ultimatum. Leave everything she knew and loved or lose you. No woman likes to be cornered that way. Jacob looked startled, as if he'd forgotten the housekeeper was present. I suppose I did, he acknowledged after a moment. I was younger then, more black and white in my thinking. And now? Eliza asked. Now I understand that life is made of greys. He looked into the fire, his profile illuminated by the dancing flames. 6 years is a long time to reflect on one's mistakes. The conversation shifted to more neutral topics as Mrs. Wilson joined them properly, sharing reminiscences about the brothers' parents and early years on the ranch. For Eliza, these stories provided valuable context, filling in the gaps that Thomas's letters had left. She learned that the Blackwell patriarch had been a stern but fair man who had built the ranch from nothing. The boy's mother had been gentler, a former schoolteacher who had insisted her sons receive a proper education despite the isolation of ranch life. Both parents had died within a year of each other, the father from a heart seizure while working, the mother from pneumonia the following winter. They left the ranch to both boys equally, Mrs. Wilson explained, which worked well enough until that mining company came sniffing around, offering a small fortune for the property. I saw an opportunity, Jacob said quietly. Thomas saw only the land our father had worked. You were both right in your ways, Mrs. Wilson said diplomatically. Though I will say the mining operation that bought the Anderson place 2 valleys over left nothing but ruin in their wake. The land is scarred beyond recovery now. Jacob's expression tightened at this news. I didn't know that. Would it have? You changed your mind back then, Eliza asked. Probably not, he admitted. I was determined to make my fortune one way or another. And did you? Eliza couldn't help asking. Make your fortune? A sardonic smile touched his lips. Not the one I envisioned. I found work on ships traveling the Pacific coast. Saved enough to buy a small shipping business in Seattle. It does well enough. Yet you came when Thomas called, Eliza observed. He was my brother, Jacob said simply. Whatever lay between us, blood is blood. Mrs. Wilson yawned then, covering her mouth apologetically. Forgive me. These old bones need rest. I've made up both your rooms with extra blankets. The house gets cold at night during storms. After the housekeeper had retired to her small bedroom off the kitchen, Eliza and Jacob remained by the fire, neither seemingly eager to end the evening. Outside, the storm continued unabated, the wind moaning around the eaves of the house. I keep thinking about Thomas's journal, Eliza said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. How lonely he was after Rebecca died. Jacob's face softened. Thomas was never good at being alone. Even as boys, he always wanted company. I was the one who could disappear for days exploring the mountains by myself. Yet you're the one who went into business, dealing with people, daily. Ironic, isn't it? He smiled faintly. Perhaps we both became what the other was meant to be. Eliza considered this. What will happen to your shipping business while you're here? I have a capable manager. He can handle things for a few weeks. Jacob's eyes met hers. Longer, if necessary. The implication hung in the air between them. Jacob wasn't planning a brief visit. He intended to stay long enough to sort out the ranch's affairs and perhaps her place in them. And if I accept your offer of partnership, she asked, voicing the question that had been in her mind since his proposal. How would that work, practically speaking? You would have a third interest. In the ranch, he said without hesitation, as if he'd already thought it through. A say in its operation, a share in its profits. This house would be your home for as long as you wish it. And your role? I would retain 2/3 ownership as Thomas's heir, but I would value your input. You're practical, observant. Those qualities are assets in ranching. I know nothing about cattle or crops. Eliza pointed out. You can learn, or you can focus on the business aspects, the accounts, the contracts. Thomas mentioned in his letters that you had experience with such things. Eliza was startled that he remembered this detail from their earlier conversation. I did, yes. At the factory in Boston. Then you already have valuable skills to contribute. He leaned forward slightly. Miss Parker, Eliza, I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a genuine partnership that would benefit us both. The earnestness in his voice was compelling. Eliza found herself wanting to believe him, wanting to trust that this unexpected turn of events might lead to a future in Montana after all, just not the one she had envisioned when boarding the train in Boston. I'll consider it, she said, finally. But I need to know one thing first. Name it. Why did you really come back? Was it truly just because Thomas called for you? Jacob was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and reflective. I came because I realized too late that I had been running from the only real home I'd ever known, because I'd spent 6 years trying to prove something to a brother who wasn't watching, because I was tired of waking up each morning in a city where no one knew my name or cared whether I lived or died. The raw honesty in his words resonate with something in Eliza. Hadn't she, too, been seeking connection when she answered Thomas's advertisement? A place to belong, people who would notice if she failed to appear one day. I understand that feeling, she said softly. Jacob's blue eyes, so like his brother's yet somehow more intense, met hers. I thought you might. The fire crackled between them, a log shifting and sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within the sturdy log walls of the Blackwell home, Eliza felt an unexpected sense of security. It's late, Jacob said, breaking the moment. We should both rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. He was right. The damaged barn roof would need proper repairs, and there would likely be other storm damage to address. Eliza rose from her chair, gathering the blanket Mrs. Wilson had provided around her shoulders. Good night, Mr. Blackwell. Jacob, she amended. Good night, Eliza, he replied, remaining by the fire. Sleep well. Upstairs in the guest room Mrs. Wilson had prepared, Eliza changed into her nightclothes and slipped between the cold sheets of the bed. The room was chilly despite the extra blankets, and she curled into herself for warmth. Her mind was too active for sleep, replaying the events of this extraordinary day. That morning she had awakened believing herself the almost widow of Thomas Blackwell. Now she knew the truth of his past marriage, had read his private thoughts about their arranged union, and had received an unexpected proposal of partnership from his estranged brother. Life, it seemed, was indeed made of greys, as Jacob had said. Eventually, the rhythmic sound of the wind and the physical exhaustion from their work in the barn lulled her into slumber. She dreamed of Boston, of the textile factory with its deafening machines and choking dust. In the dream, she was trying to find her way out, but every door led back to the factory floor. Then suddenly, a door appeared that led to an open meadow, surrounded by mountains, the grass swaying in a gentle breeze. She woke at dawn to silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world transformed. From her window, Eliza could see the ranch blanketed in pristine white. The morning sun turning the snow into a field of diamonds. The damage was evident even from here. Fallen branches, a section of fence collapsed under the weight of a small avalanche from the hillside. But the beauty was undeniable. A movement caught her eye. Jacob was already outside, making his way toward the barn, a shovel over his shoulder. He paused, looking back at the house, and for a moment Eliza thought he might have seen her at the window. He raised a hand in what could have been a greeting before continuing his journey through the deep snow. Quickly dressing in her warmest clothes, Eliza made her way downstairs. Mrs. Wilson was already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cast iron stove and preparing breakfast. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Eliza admitted. "The storm has passed. Just before dawn, we got nearly 2 feet of snow from the look of it. Jacob's gone to check on the animals and assess the damage." "I should help," Eliza said, reaching for her coat. Mrs. Wilson's weathered hand stopped her. "Breakfast first. No sense facing the cold on an empty stomach." The practical wisdom in this advice was undeniable. Eliza sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Wilson served hot coffee and a hearty plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. As she ate, Eliza found herself curious about the housekeeper's perspective on the situation. "Mrs. Wilson, may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "What do you think of Jacob's offer to make me a partner in the ranch?" The older woman considered this while wiping down the counter. "I think it's a fair offer, better than most women in your situation might receive." "But do you think he means it? That he truly sees value in such a partnership?" Mrs. Wilson turned, studying Eliza with shrewd eyes. "Jacob Blackwell has his faults, make no mistake. He's stubborn as a mule, quick to anger and slow to forgive, but he's never been a liar. If he offered you a partnership, he means it." This assessment aligned with Eliza's own impressions. Whatever else Jacob might be, he seemed fundamentally honest, perhaps bluntly so at times. "There's something else you should know," Mrs. Wilson continued, sitting across from Eliza. "Thomas left debts. This was unexpected." "What sort of debts?" "The medical kind, mostly. His illness was prolonged and the doctor had to come from town daily near the end. Then there were the telegrams to Jacob, special medicines ordered from Helena." She sighed. "The ranch is land-rich but cash-poor right now. Spring is always tight until the first cattle go to market." "I see," Eliza said slowly, understanding Dawn. "So Jacob needs help running the ranch." "He needs a partner," Mrs. Wilson corrected. "Someone with a stake in seeing the place succeed. The hands will work for wages, but they won't put in the extra effort that ownership inspires." This practical consideration put Jacob's offer in a new light. It wasn't just about honoring Thomas's wishes or providing for Eliza. It was also about the survival of the Blackwell Ranch itself. "Thank you for telling me this," Eliza said sincerely. Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "You seem like a sensible woman. Miss Parker, you deserve to make your decision with all the facts before you." After finishing breakfast, Eliza bundled up in her coat, scarf, and gloves. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside, but the brilliance of the sun-drenched landscape momentarily took her breath away. Mountains rose on 3 sides of the valley, their slopes heavy with snow, their peaks disappearing into wispy clouds. She made her way carefully to the barn, following Jacob's tracks through the deep snow. Inside, she found him in the rafters, assessing the damage they had temporarily secured the night before. "It's worse than I thought," he called down when he saw her. "We'll need to replace this entire section of roofing." "The animals seem calm enough," Eliza observed, noting the horses and cattle contentedly eating from their feed troughs. "Animals adapt quickly," Jacob said, making his way down from the rafters. "People are the ones who struggle with change." There was truth in this simple observation. Eliza had certainly been struggling with the rapid changes in her circumstances since arriving in Rivercrest. "Mrs. Wilson told me about the debts," she said directly. Jacob's expression tightened momentarily before he nodded. "I should have mentioned that myself. Yes, there are debts, nothing catastrophic, but enough to create pressure until the spring drive." "Is that why you offered me a partnership rather than buying me out?" He looked surprised by her directness, then smiled faintly. "Partly," he admitted. "The ranch doesn't have the cash reserves for a buyout right now, but that's not the only reason." "What's the other reason?" Jacob set down the hammer he'd been holding and faced her squarely. "Because I've been alone for 6 years, running from responsibilities I should have embraced, Because Thomas saw something in you worth crossing the country for. And because last night, watching you work alongside me in a crisis without complaint, I began to think he might have been right. The simple honesty of his answer caught Eliza off guard. She had expected practical reasons, business calculations. Instead, Jacob had offered something more personal, more vulnerable. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said carefully. And I'm inclined to accept with conditions." Jacob's eyebrows rose. "Name them." "First, our agreement must be legally documented. I want no misunderstandings about my stake in the property." He nodded. "Reasonable. Judge Henderson in town can draw up the papers." "Second, I want 3 months to learn the business before making any final commitment. If, after that time, either of us feels the partnership isn't working, you'll buy out my share at a predetermined price." "Also reasonable," Jacob agreed, "though we'll need to specify that price now, in the agreement." "Third," Eliza continued, "I will have my own room in the house and the freedom to come and go as I please. My involvement in this ranch is strictly business." At this, something like amusement flickered in Jacob's eyes. "Did you think I was proposing something else, Miss Parker?" A flush rose to Eliza's cheeks. "I wanted to be clear about expectations." "Crystal clear," Jacob said, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Anything else?" Eliza hesitated, then added her final condition. "I want to keep the study Thomas prepared for me, as he intended it." The amusement faded from Jacob's face, replaced by something softer, more solemn. "Of course, that room is yours, however this arrangement proceeds." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Parker?" Eliza looked at his offered hand, strong, calloused, capable, and thought about the path that had led her to this moment. None of it had unfolded as she'd expected when boarding the train in Boston. Thomas was gone, his promises unfulfilled. Yet here was his brother, offering a different future, one with its own challenges and possibilities. She took his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. "We have an agreement, Mr. Blackwell," and in that handshake, standing in a snow-damaged barn on a Montana ranch 5,000 miles from her former home, Eliza Parker felt the first stirrings of a new beginning, one she had never anticipated, but which now stretched before her like the unbroken snow across the valley, pristine, challenging, and full of undiscovered potential. The journey into Rivercrest proved challenging. After 2 days of clearing paths around the ranch and making temporary repairs to the barn roof, Jacob had hitched the horses to the sleigh, the only viable transportation with the roads still blanketed in snow. "It's not the most comfortable ride," he warned, as he helped Eliza up onto the wooden bench, "but the runners cut through snow better than wagon wheels." Mrs. Wilson had packed them sandwiches and a thermos of hot coffee for the journey. "You'll likely be stuck in town overnight," she cautioned. "The days are still short, and you don't want to be caught on that road after dark." Eliza had packed a small valise with necessities, anticipating the overnight stay. She had mixed feelings about returning to Rivercrest. On one hand, she was eager to make their partnership agreement official. On the other, she dreaded facing the curious gazes and inevitable gossip their arrangement would generate. The sleigh ride was indeed rough, the wooden bench unforgiving despite the blankets Jacob had provided. But the scenery compensated for the discomfort. The valley transformed under snow was breathtaking, pristine white fields stretching toward mountains that pierced a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. "It's beautiful," Eliza remarked, breaking a comfortable silence that had stretched between them. Jacob nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This is the Montana Thomas wrote to you about, the one most people never see. I can understand why he couldn't leave it," she said softly. "Even for Rebecca." Jacob's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "You've been thinking about that? About Thomas and Rebecca?" "It helps me understand him better. The man I was corresponding with. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He never lied in his letters, not exactly. He just omitted significant truths. We all omit truths sometimes, Jacob observed. It's human nature to present ourselves in the best possible light. Eliza considered this. What truths have you omitted, Jacob Blackwell? She asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He glanced at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. Now that would be telling, wouldn't it? Hardly fair when you know so. Much about me, do I? He navigated the sleigh around a fallen branch. I know you worked in a Boston textile factory. I know your father was a carpenter. I know you're practical, hard-working, and surprisingly resilient. Beyond that, you remain a mystery, Miss Parker. Hardly a mystery, she protested. My life has been quite ordinary. I doubt that very much, Jacob replied, his tone suggesting he meant it. They reached Rivercrest by mid-afternoon. The town had recovered from the storm remarkably well, with paths shoveled between buildings and smoke rising steadily from chimneys. Several people stopped to wave or call greetings as Jacob guided the sleigh down the main street. News travels fast, he murmured, nodding to a group of men outside the general store who were watching them with undisguised curiosity. By now, everyone knows you're staying at the ranch. Does that concern you? Eliza asked. What people might think? Not particularly, but it might concern you once you hear what they're saying. And what might that be? Jacob's expression was unreadable. That you came to marry one Blackwell brother and have settled for the other instead. Heat rose in Eliza's cheeks. That's preposterous. Our arrangement is strictly business. You and I know that, Jacob agreed, but small towns thrive on more interesting narratives. He guided the sleigh to a hitching post outside a small, well-maintained building, with a sign identifying it as the office of Judge Henry Henderson, County Magistrate. Before Jacob could help her down, the door opened, and a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and spectacles stepped out. Jacob Blackwell, the judge greeted him. Sheriff Hayes mentioned you'd be coming by today, and this must be Miss Parker. Judge Henderson, Jacob acknowledged with a nod. Yes, this is Miss Eliza Parker. We've come to formalize a business agreement. The judge's eyebrows rose fractionally. I see. We'll come in out of the cold. Mrs. Henderson has a fire going and coffee brewing. Inside, the judge's office was warm and smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. Mrs. Henderson, a petite woman with kind eyes, took their coats and ushered them into a sitting room adjacent to the judge's formal office. You'll want to thaw out a bit before getting down to business, she insisted, serving coffee and slices of apple cake. Judge Henderson settled into an armchair, studying them both with intelligent eyes. Sheriff Hayes filled me in on your situation. Miss Parker, a difficult circumstance arriving to find your intended destination had passed. Yes, Eliza agreed simply, unwilling to elaborate. And now I understand you and Jacob have reached some sort of arrangement regarding the Blackwell Ranch. Jacob outlined their agreement. Eliza would receive a 1/3 interest in the ranch in exchange for her active participation in its management, with a 3-month trial period and predetermined buyout terms, should either party wish to dissolve the partnership. The judge listened attentively, occasionally making notes on a small pad. When Jacob finished, he turned to Eliza. And you entered into this arrangement of your own free will, Miss Parker, without any coercion or undue pressure? I did, Eliza confirmed. It seems the most practical solution for both of us. Practical, the judge repeated, a note of amusement in his voice. Yes, I suppose it is that. He rose from his chair. Let me draw up the papers. It shouldn't take more than an hour. Mrs. Henderson will keep you comfortable in the meantime. As the judge disappeared into his office, Mrs. Henderson refreshed their coffee cups. "You're staying overnight in town?" she asked conversationally. "We'd planned to," Jacob confirmed. "The roads aren't safe after dark, especially with the new snow." "Then you must join us for dinner," she insisted. "I've made a venison roast that's far too large for just the two of us." Jacob glanced at Eliza, who nodded. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Henderson," she said. "We'd be delighted." Once their dinner plans were settled, Mrs. Henderson excused herself to make preparations, leaving Eliza and Jacob alone in the sitting room. An unexpected awkwardness settled between them, the first since their handshake in the barn 2 days ago. "Judge Henderson seems thorough," Eliza observed, breaking the silence. "He is," Jacob agreed. "He was a friend of our father's, honest to a fault." "Good. I want everything to be clear and above board." Jacob studied her over the rim of his coffee. "In cup. Having second thoughts?" "No," she said, surprising herself with how true it was. "Are you?" A slight smile touched his lips. "No." The door to the judge's office opened and he beckoned them inside. "I've prepared the partnership agreement according to your specifications," he explained, gesturing to papers laid out on his desk. "I've also taken the liberty of including a separate document that clarifies the ownership of the house and personal effects to avoid any future misunderstandings." For the next half hour, they reviewed the documents carefully. Eliza was impressed by the judge's thoroughness and clarity. Every concern she might have raised had been anticipated and addressed. "If these terms are acceptable to both parties, you may sign," Judge Henderson said finally, offering his pen first to Jacob, then to Eliza. As she signed her name on the indicated lines, Eliza felt a curious mixture of emotions. Relief at having secured her immediate future, satisfaction at the fairness of the terms, and something else, a strange sense of rightness about the path she now found herself on. Judge Henderson signed as witness, then stamped each document with his official seal. "I'll file the originals in the county records," he explained, handing each of them a copy. "These are now legally binding contracts." "Thank you, Judge," Jacob said, tucking his copy inside his coat. "What do we owe you for your services?" The judge waved away the question. "Consider it a wedding gift that arrived a bit late and in a different form," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "Or perhaps just the payment of an old debt to your father, who helped me build my first house when I arrived in this territory 30 years ago." As they prepared to leave the office, Judge Henderson placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Your brother would approve, I think," he said quietly, "of how you're handling things." Something flickered across Jacob's face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I hope so," he replied simply. Outside, the afternoon was waning, the air growing sharper. With the approaching evening, Jacob suggested they visit the general store before returning to the judge's house for dinner. "We need supplies," he explained, "and you might want a few things for yourself now that you're staying on at the ranch." The general store was busy with late afternoon customers. Conversations momentarily halted when Eliza and Jacob entered, then resumed with a noticeable undercurrent of curiosity. Mr. Mitchell, the proprietor, greeted them warmly. "Miss Parker, Mr. Blackwell, what can I help you with today?" Jacob handed over a list of ranch supplies, while Eliza browsed the store's offerings. She selected a few practical items: a writing desk for her room, paper and ink, a new hairbrush to replace one broken during her journey. As she examined a display of fabric, considering whether to purchase material for new curtains in the study, she became aware of whispered conversations nearby. 2 women, approximately her own age, were watching her while pretending to examine canned goods. "That's her, the mail-order bride," one murmured, not quite softly enough. "Can you imagine arriving to find your fiancé dead and then taking up with his brother instead?" "Shameless," the other agreed. "My mother says she hasn't even observed a proper mourning period." Eliza's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression neutral as she selected a bolt of blue cotton. Moving to the counter, she placed it beside Jacob's supplies. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked, seemingly oblivious. "To the gossiping women." "No, this will do for now," Eliza replied, grateful that her voice remained steady. Mr. Mitchell tallied their purchases efficiently. "Shall I have these delivered to the ranch?" he asked. "Just the larger items," Jacob decided. "We'll take the smaller things with us now. We're staying in town tonight at Judge Henderson's. This information would undoubtedly feed the town gossip mill further, but there was no help for it." Eliza held her head high as they exited the store, pretending not to notice the speculative gazes following them. "You heard them, didn't you?" Jacob asked quietly as they walked back toward the judge's house. "The women in the store. It doesn't matter," Eliza said firmly. "People will always talk." "It matters if it bothers you," he countered. "This partnership doesn't require you to endure public scrutiny or judgment." His concern touched her. "I've survived worse than small town gossip, Jacob. In the factory, girls would spread rumors that could cost you your position, your reputation, your very livelihood. This is mild by comparison." He studied her with newfound respect. "You're a surprising woman, Eliza Parker." "So you've mentioned before," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips despite her earlier discomfort. Dinner at the Hendersons proved to be a pleasant affair. The judge and his wife were gracious hosts, steering conversation toward neutral topics: the spring planting, the latest books they'd received from the back east, news of railroad expansion that might eventually connect Rivercrest to larger markets. Only once did the subject of Thomas arise, when Mrs. Henderson asked gently about plans for maintaining his grave. "I'd like to plant some flowers when the weather warms," Eliza said thoughtfully. "He mentioned loving wildflowers in his letters." "The purple lupine was his favorite," Jacob added unexpectedly. "He used to collect bouquets for our mother when we were boys." This small, personal detail about Thomas touched Eliza. It was the first time Jacob had volunteered such a memory, and it felt like a gift. A glimpse of the man she had never had, the chance to know. After dinner, Judge Henderson invited Jacob to his study for brandy and cigars, leaving Eliza and Mrs. Henderson in the parlor. "You've had quite an ordeal, my dear," the older woman said, kindly pouring tea, "arriving in a strange place, only to have your plans so completely upended." "Life rarely follows the paths we expect," Eliza replied, accepting the cup. "We can only adapt as best we can." Mrs. Henderson studied her thoughtfully. "You seem remarkably composed for someone who has endured such disappointments." "Perhaps because I've learned not to expect too much," Eliza said with a slight smile. "It makes the surprises more bearable when they come." "A practical philosophy," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "Though I hope you'll allow yourself to expect happiness occasionally. It does find us sometimes, often when we least anticipate it." There was something knowing in the older woman's expression that made Eliza wonder just how much she had observed during dinner. Had Jacob's glances lingered on her too often? Had her own responses revealed more than she intended? "My partnership with Jacob is strictly business," she said firmly. Mrs. Henderson smiled over her teacup. "Of course, my dear. I never suggested otherwise." The evening concluded pleasantly, and Eliza was shown to a comfortable guest room. Exhausted from the journey and the day's events, she fell asleep almost immediately, the signed partnership agreement safely tucked beneath her pillow. Morning brought clear skies and slightly warmer temperatures, a hint that spring might eventually arrive despite winter's lingering grip. After breakfast, Jacob was eager to start back to the ranch. "The snow will be melting on the southern slopes," he explained. "That can mean mudslides if we get more rain. I want to check the condition. of the north pasture fences. They bid farewell to the Hendersons, promising to return for Sunday dinner when next in town. The sleigh ride back seemed faster somehow, perhaps because the path had been travelled more since their journey in. "What will you do first?" Jacob asked as they passed the halfway point to the ranch. "Now that our partnership is official?" Eliza had been considering this very question. "Review the accounts," she decided. "I need to understand exactly where we stand financially before spring arrives." Jacob nodded, approval evident in his expression. Practical as always. Thomas kept the ledgers in his desk drawer. They should be up to date through January, before he fell ill. And after that? Somewhat haphazard, I'm afraid. Mrs. Wilson did her best, but numbers were never her strength. They lapsed into a comfortable silence, broken only by the jingle of the harness bells and the swish of the runners through snow. Eliza found herself studying Jacob's profile as he guided the horses. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for any sign of trouble. He was nothing like the man she had imagined Thomas to be from his letters. Where Thomas had described himself as thoughtful and methodical, Jacob was decisive, sometimes impulsive. Thomas had written with careful consideration. Jacob spoke directly, sometimes bluntly. Yet there were similarities too. A certain integrity, a commitment to the land and its care. "You're staring," Jacob observed without looking at her. "Do I have breakfast on my face?" Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was just thinking about how different you are from how Thomas described himself in his letters." "Different better, or different worse?" There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Just different," she replied diplomatically. They crested a small rise, and the ranch came into view below them. The main house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn with its partially repaired roof, the outbuildings and corrals laid out in a pattern that spoke of decades of practical use. "Home?" Jacob said simply, a note in his voice that suggested the word held more meaning for him now than it had in years. Mrs. Wilson was waiting on the porch when they arrived, her expression anxious. "Thank goodness you're back," she called, as Jacob brought the sleigh to a halt. "We've had trouble." Jacob was instantly alert. "What kind of trouble?" "Ryder came by this morning. Spotted wolf tracks on the north ridge, near where the pregnant heifers are pastured." Mrs. Wilson twisted her apron in her hands. "Carter and Davis went out to check, but they only took one rifle between them. Wolves were a constant threat to cattle ranches, especially in late winter when game was scarce and newborn calves presented easy targets." Eliza had read about this in Thomas's letters, though he had never described it as an immediate concern. "Hitch up the wagon," Jacob instructed, one of the ranch hands who had appeared from the bunkhouse. "We'll need to move those heifers closer to the main pasture." "I'll come with you," Eliza said decisively. Both Jacob and Mrs. Wilson looked at her in surprise. "It's dangerous work," Jacob cautioned. "The heifers will be skittish if they've scented wolves, and the terrain is rough up there." "I'm your partner now," Eliza reminded him. "I need to learn all aspects of ranching, not just the accounts." A slow smile spread across Jacob's face. "So you do." He turned to Mrs. Wilson. "Pack us some food. We may be out till dusk." While the wagon was being prepared, Eliza changed into her sturdiest boots and warmest clothes. She had no experience with cattle or wolves, but she was determined to prove herself useful. This partnership would only work if she fully committed to the ranch and its operations. Jacob was checking rifles when she emerged from the house. He handed her a small revolver, demonstrating how to load and fire it. "This is only for emergencies," he emphasized. "Wolves generally avoid humans unless desperate or cornered." The North Ridge was a 3-mile journey from the main house, much of it uphill through melting snow that made the wagon wheels sink and struggle. Twice they had to get out and push the vehicle through particularly deep drifts. "Spring in Montana," Jacob observed dryly as they climbed back into the wagon after the second such effort. All the beauty with twice the inconvenience. They found Carter and Davis, two of the ranch's most experienced hands, keeping watch. Over a small herd of about 20 cattle, the pregnant heifers were visibly nervous, clustered together and alert to every sound. "Found tracks all along the ridge," Carter reported, pointing toward the tree line. "Fresh, too, made within the last day or so." "Any missing cattle?" Jacob asked, scanning the herd. "Not yet, but it's just a matter of time. This pack is bold. They came within 50 yards of the herd last night, according to the tracks." Jacob made a quick decision. "We'll move them down to the east pasture, closer to the house. It'll mean extra feeding until the grass comes in, but better that than losing calves." Moving nervous cattle through difficult terrain proved to be even more challenging than Eliza had anticipated. The heifers, heavy with their unborn calves, moved slowly and balked at patches of deep snow. The men worked with practiced efficiency, but it was still backbreaking work. Eliza found her role quickly enough. She stationed herself at the rear of the herd, helping to keep stragglers moving forward. The work was exhausting, but oddly satisfying. By mid-afternoon, they had successfully relocated the herd to the lower pasture, where foothills provided shelter from the wind, and the ranch house was visible in the distance. "Not bad for your first cattle drive," Jacob commented as they secured the pasture gate. "Small as it was." "I think I'll feel it tomorrow," Eliza admitted, rubbing her lower back. "But it's good to contribute something beyond numbers in a ledger." "The ledgers matter too," he assured her. "Every part of ranching matters, from calving to accounting. That's what makes it a complete life." The phrase struck Eliza. A complete life. Wasn't that what she had been seeking when she answered Thomas's advertisement? Not just marriage, but a life with purpose, with meaningful work. As they rode back to the ranch house in the wagon, the setting sun painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, Eliza felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced since arriving in Montana. This wasn't the future she had planned, but perhaps it was the future she needed. Jacob seemed to sense her mood. "Having second thoughts about our partnership, Miss Parker?" he asked, his tone light. "Not at all, Mr. Blackwell," she replied with a small smile. "In fact, I'm thinking it might work out better than either of us expected." His answering smile was warm, transforming his usually serious expression. "I believe you might be right." And as the wagon rumbled toward home, for the Blackwell Ranch was indeed becoming home to her, Eliza found herself looking forward to tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow with growing anticipation rather than dread. The unexpected path sometimes proved to be the right one after all. Spring arrived in the Montana Valley with startling swiftness. One week, patches of snow still clung to shadowed places. The next, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in explosions of purple, yellow, and blue. The transformation mirrored the changes at the Blackwell Ranch, and within Eliza herself. The 3-month trial period of their partnership agreement had passed almost without notice, both of them too busy with spring carving, fence repairs, and preparing fields for planting to mark the date. When Eliza finally realized, during a quiet evening reviewing the ledgers in her study, she was surprised by her own lack of hesitation about making the arrangement permanent. "The buyout date passed last week," she mentioned casually to Jacob over breakfast the next morning. He looked up from his coffee, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "So it did. I hadn't realized." He set down his cup carefully. "Have you made a decision?" "I have," she replied, buttering a biscuit with deliberate calm. "I'd like to stay." The tension in his shoulders eased visibly. "I'm glad to hear it. The ranch is running better with you here." It was true. Under Eliza's management, the accounts were now meticulously organized. She had negotiated better prices with suppliers, established a proper record-keeping system, for the cattle, and even set aside emergency funds for unexpected expenses. The ranch's finances, while still tight, were significantly more stable than when she had arrived, but her contributions went beyond ledgers and invoices. She had thrown herself into learning every aspect of ranch operations, from helping deliver calves to mending fences. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of a city woman as part owner, now tipped their hats respectfully when she gave instructions. "It's not just the ranch that's better off," Jacob added, his voice quieter. "We all are." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Over the months of working side by side, their relationship had evolved, from wariness to respect to something neither seemed ready to name. Mrs. Wilson had observed the change with knowing eyes, but kept her comments to herself, merely ensuring that fresh wildflowers appeared regularly in Eliza's study, and that Jacob's favorite meals appeared on evenings when they worked late together. "I should ride into town today," Eliza said, changing the subject. "The new fabrics for the parlor curtains should have arrived, and we need more coffee." "I'll come with you," Jacob offered. "I need to speak with Judge Henderson about the water rights for the east pasture." The ride to Rivercrest was pleasant, the spring air fragrant with pine and new growth. They traveled on horseback now that the roads had dried, Eliza on a gentle mare named Daisy that Jacob had purchased specifically for her, and Jacob on his sturdy gelding, Thunder. Rivercrest had changed its attitude toward them as spring progressed. The initial gossip had faded as the townspeople observed their business-like relationship. The fact that Eliza maintained her own bedroom at the ranch, a detail Mrs. Wilson had subtly communicated through town, had helped quiet the more salacious rumors. They completed their business efficiently, collecting the fabric Eliza had ordered, purchasing supplies, and consulting with Judge Henderson about the water rights issue. As they prepared to leave town, they encountered Sheriff Hayes outside the general store. "Miss Parker, Mr. Blackwell," he greeted them. "Just the people I was hoping to see. A letter arrived for you yesterday." He handed an envelope to Eliza. "From Boston, by the look of it." Eliza recognized the handwriting immediately. Mary Sullivan, her former roommate at the boarding house. She tucked the letter into her pocket, curious but unwilling to read it in public. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "How are things in town?" "Quiet enough," he replied. "Though we're expecting the cattle buyers from Chicago next month." Always livens things up. They chatted a few minutes longer before continuing their journey home. Once back at the ranch, Eliza excused herself to read her letter in the privacy of her study. Mary's news was startling. The textile factory where Eliza had worked had burned to the ground, leaving hundreds without employment. More personally, Mary wrote that Eliza's former suitor, a floor manager named Richard Collins, who had pursued her half-heartedly for years, had been asking about her whereabouts. "He claims to have had a change of heart after your departure," Mary wrote. "Says he made a terrible mistake in not proposing properly before you left. He's even mentioned traveling west to find you. I thought you should know, though I told him nothing of your specific location." Eliza set the letter down, emotions churning. Richard Collins had been part of her decision to accept Thomas's proposal. His lukewarm attention and inability to commit had convinced her that practical partnership with a stranger might be preferable to years of emotional uncertainty. The thought of him appearing in Rivercrest was unsettling, not because she harbored any remaining feelings for him, but because his presence would disrupt the life she had carefully built here, the life she now realized she cherished. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Jacob stood there, his expression concerned. "Bad news from Boston?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. "Not exactly," Eliza hedged. "Just unexpected." Jacob hesitated. "I don't mean to pry. I just wanted to let you know that Carter spotted a bobcat near the chicken." "Coop, I'll be setting traps tonight." "I'll help," she offered automatically, her mind still half on the letter. "Eliza," Jacob said gently, "if you want to talk about whatever's in that letter, I'm here." The simple offer of support touched her. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have considered confiding in Jacob Blackwell. Now it seems like the most natural thing in the world. "It's from my former roommate in Boston," she explained. "A man I once knew is apparently planning to come west to find me." Jacob's expression stilled. "A suitor?" "Of sorts. Not a very determined one until I left, apparently." She folded the letter carefully. "It doesn't matter. That part of my life is over." "Is it?" Jacob asked quietly. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm not the same woman who left Boston 3 months ago." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "No, you're not. You're stronger now, more certain of yourself." "Montana agrees with me," Eliza said with a small smile. "It does," Jacob agreed. "But I think it's more than that. I think you've found your purpose here." The truth of his words resonated within her. She had found purpose at the Blackwell Ranch, not just in the work, but in the connections she had formed. With Mrs. Wilson, who had become something of a mother. Vigor, with the ranch hands, who respected her growing knowledge and fair management. And with Jacob himself. "I have," she acknowledged, "more than I ever expected to." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a softening, a decision made. "Eliza, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened inexplicably. "Yes? Our arrangement has worked well these past months. The legal partnership has benefited the ranch tremendously." "I agree," she said cautiously, uncertain where he was heading. Jacob took a deep breath. "But I find myself wanting more than a business partnership with you." The words hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing simultaneously. For wasn't this the unspoken current that had been building between them for weeks now? "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwell?" Eliza asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "A courtship," he said simply. "Proper and traditional, no rush, no pressure. Just the opportunity to explore whether what I feel for you, what I hope you might feel for me, could grow into something more permanent." Eliza thought of Thomas, the man she had traveled across the country to marry. She thought of his letters, his hopes for companionship rather than love. She thought of his journal entries about Rebecca, and how he had believed true love came only once in a lifetime. And then she looked at Jacob, this complicated, straightforward man who had offered her a future when she had none, who had worked alongside her through winter storms and spring mud, who had respected her independence while quietly hoping for more. "I would like that," she said softly. "A courtship." The smile that transformed his face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. "I thought perhaps we might begin with dinner. In town Saturday night," he suggested, "at the hotel restaurant, as a proper couple, not business partners." "The gossips of Rivercrest will have a field day," Eliza observed with a smile. "Let them," Jacob replied. "For once they'll be right." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Eliza stood on the porch of what had become her home. In the distance, she could see Jacob checking the perimeter fences one last time before nightfall, a daily ritual that spoke of his care for the land and its creatures. She thought about the circuitous path that had led her here, the desperation that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement, the journey across the country to marry a man she had never met, the devastating news upon her arrival, and the unexpected opportunity that had emerged from tragedy. None of it had unfolded as she had planned or expected, yet somehow it had led her to exactly where she needed to be. As Jacob approached the house, his figure silhouetted against the sunset, Eliza felt a certainty she had never experienced before. This man, so different from his brother, so different from what she had thought she wanted, might just be exactly what she needed. Life, as Jacob had once observed, was indeed made of greys, of unexpected paths and second chances, of finding love where you least expected it. Thomas had written to her of the Montana sky, of how it stretched endlessly above the ranch, making all human concerns seem small by comparison. Standing on the porch of what was now her home, waiting for Jacob to join her for the evening meal, Eliza finally understood what he had meant. Under that vast sky, anything seemed possible, even finding love after heartbreak, even building a family from the fragments of broken dreams, even discovering that the end of one journey was merely the beginning of another, far more wonderful than she could have imagined. And as Jacob reached the porch steps, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that banished the evening chill, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that her unexpected path had led her exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.